at some point you have to up your game. We talk to sellers about if you want your buyers to feel like fully informed buyers, you've got to act like a fully informed seller. And that means you got to do a little bit more homework.
Welcome back to the Thoughts on Selling podcast. Today, it is my pleasure to have Ted McKenna join me to talk about all things sales. Ted, welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
Ted, the first question I always ask a guest, and I warn them ahead of time, so I'm sure you've prepared for this, is, and I'm not even sure we need to ask this because you're a well-known author and consultant, but I'm going to ask anyway. Who is Ted McKenna?
Yeah, I was contemplating just how deep do we go here? Should I act like I'm sort of laying on the couch and bearing it all, or no, I'll just give you kind of the bare bones quick bio. So I think about me as a researcher by trade, and we sort of made a career out of trying to understand what's happening with buyers, how things are evolving, more critically, how high-performing sellers are adjusting. They sort of figure it out before other people do. And so we try to aim research at trying to understand what they have figured out that others haven't, to help other people replicate that. So that comes through, research, and then books and articles, and then eventually training curriculum and what have you. I grew up professionally at a company called CEB, or Corporate Executive Board, which is now part of Gartner, and a whole bunch of my longtime research partners and now co-founders also part of that network too. So yeah, excited to be here and share a little bit about what we see. And I'd also be curious about what you're seeing out there too.
So thank you for that introduction. And so that leads to a lot of questions. First, are you a natural data geek?
I confess that I am, yes. I'm not a data scientist, but I've worked with a bunch of them. And there was a short stint, Matt Dixon, my longtime research partner and co-author, and I both worked at a company called Tether, which is in the conversation intelligence space. And that was, although we were only there about 4 years, I got to work with some real data geeks in the best possible way. I was just like a kid in the candy store, learning about sort of the data side of machine learning models and predictive sort of AI models and scoring. Yeah, I love that. One of the best parts of doing research, whether it is a survey-based, study, or if it's something a little bit more in depth, like we did with the JOLT Effect. One of the best parts is like when you first get the data back, it's a little messy, well, sometimes a lot messy, and you're trying to sort of make sense of what's happening, what the story is. But that's one of the most fun parts of the kind of the study cycle, is getting a first peek at that data.
Yeah, I know the feeling. And it strikes me also that you are, at minimum, a behavioral analyst, right? You study what makes people tick.
Yeah, Matt likes to say, I think he puts it well, that he sort of regards himself as a sales anthropologist. And I think that's a pretty decent description of kind of what drives us and what types of things we're kind of interested in. How are humans adjusting to things? I'm sort of an econ guy going back to school. And so I like sort of the human buyer-seller exchange element here. How do you create demand out of nothing? And of course, there's all sorts of human dynamics in terms of running a sales organization too, and motivating people and incentivizing them as well. But yeah, I think that sort of anthropologist take is probably a decent way to think about us.
I ask my coaching clients to be CSI profilers. Right? At the individual level, when they're planning a conversation with a prospect or a client, think about what makes them tick. Think about their language of value. Think about how to make a deposit in the relationship bank account. But let's go back to something else you said. I also am a student of the dismal science. I was an econ major as well. And the reason I chose economics was because as a teenager, right, late teens, I had this revelation. If you understand what makes money move in a particular direction, that's good.
Yeah. Give it on a basic level, honestly, like one of the easiest ways to understand a company is how do they make money, just on a quite literal basis. Who pays them? When do they pay them? And for what do they pay them for? It sounds like an obvious thing, but for some reason it's not as quite as obvious to everyone else, but it's usually the root of a lot of things.
Yeah. And that leads sometimes to interesting conversations. I was involved in a startup that was providing services to mobile workers at a really bad time, just before 9/11, when at some point in our short duration, mobile workers stopped traveling, but we found ourselves talking with American Express. They wanted our content. We wanted their traffic. And so it's like, okay, which way does the money flow in this particular position? And we never could figure it out. And then 9/11 happened and our business went away.
Okay.
So let's talk about the evolution of your research or your writings. You had a couple of groundbreaking books on the selling model and how to run sales organizations and how to sell. And all of that is ancient history. Then the pandemic happened and people's physical engagement models completely changed. Everybody went virtual. And this gave you as a researcher an opportunity to study tens of thousands of interactions. And I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'm setting this up as the conversation. You saw a fundamental shift from that traditional solution selling model to the JOLT model, where you need to understand what's going on and limit the buyer's ability to go in multiple directions and strongly help them with their buying decision. Not give them more information because they're drowning in information, but to help them make decisions.
Yeah, we can get into the study itself, which to your point was an interesting time on its own. And we sort of took advantage of the fact that sales became 100% virtual overnight
and visible to you as a researcher.
And measurable, right?
Yep.
And being able to use call recordings and other things to understand at scale things happening that we never probably could have and never really will be able to again. So actually, there's 2.5 million calls in total that we studied as part of that. But if you sort of zoom out, I was on the research teams for the Challenger sale that your audience might be aware of. That's going back, 15, 16 to 17 years. Matt obviously was a co-author of that along with Brent Adamson. And the broad theme at that time was buyers learning on their own, coming into that interaction and that journey pretty far into their process. And so forcing the seller into kind of commoditized bots where they're placing them in a box and forcing them to compete on price mostly. And so the seller was forced to try to decide, do I accept that demand and try to win my fair share of it? Or do I find ways to reframe their perspective and try to create new demand for new issues? That trend of buyers learning on their own, whether they're right or wrong in terms of what they concluded, is a separate story, right? But that trend, of course, has only gotten worse. In fact, you could probably argue buyers have never been more informed than ever before, and Gen AI is probably going to make that even worse. I guess it depends on how you think that's a good or a bad thing. But now they're going to have that making quite literally predictions or recommendations on this provider versus that provider.
ChatGPT is the new search engine. Salespeople are telling me that customers are reaching out saying, ChatGPT put you on the short list.
Yes, exactly. But maybe go as even a step further, which is choose this one for that one, choose this other provider for this other thing. Again, whether it's right or wrong is a separate question, but that goes a step further than like a Gartner Magic Quadrant, for example, that places them all on the spectrum, and then it's up to the buyer to decide. And so again, that trend of buyers being highly informed has only gotten worse. And yet at the same time, a big part of the Jolt story was a significant increase in hesitation to purchase. One of the first big findings from Jolt was more and more deals ending in no decision, 40 to 60% of deals ending in no decision. And you sort of look at those two things together, and it's this kind of massive conundrum for the seller, because what it feels like almost is as if the more informed the buyer gets, the more hesitant they get.
Ted, we've known that from retail for 50 years. If you go into a retail store and you have 3 options on the shelf, it's easy to make a decision. If you have 30, you walk away confused.
Yes, that specific element of being overwhelmed and choice overload and what have you on the consumer side, to your point, is something that we all have felt. One of the things we wanted to examine at Jolt was, does that same thing happen when you go to spend other people's money as part of a business? And it turns out it is true. That's one of several factors that drives some of this hesitancy. But the point being, I think, for the seller is, what the heck do you do there? Because, of course, the answer can't be stop educating the customer or stop answering their questions, even though we know at some point they become their own worst enemy, trying to look for certainty in places they can't actually get to certainty. And so that, broadly speaking, has been sort of a big research project that we've been kind of on the hunt for, is how do you engage a buyer like that, who kind of comes in with these entrenched beliefs, is rather combative in nature with lots of objections, some of them value-based, some of them fear-based, and yet are sort of very unproductive in how they explore and often end in these no decisions. How do you engage? How do you forecast? How do you qualify? Like, a lot of the math has changed in terms of that cycle dynamic. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but for us, that's kind of the broad set of trends that we're keeping an eye on.
Yeah. There's an underlying thread that you've identified, and it comes out in your most recent book, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that's selling using provocation, or selling using a point of view or a business value hypothesis. That's been strong for a long time. I vaguely recall that you wrote about it, and that was what, early 2000s?
So our first, call it Challenger study, actually the marketing practice at CEB had a study in like the 2007 timeframe, this model that was about sort of learn, teach, amplify, they called it. And then we studied it in the sales side. So for us, yeah, it was kind of like the 07, 08 timeframe.
Yeah, it's no less true today. I had a conversation 10 years ago with a key account director. He was new to a large insurance company, and he had kind of went kicking and screaming. He was perfectly happy selling databases, but didn't want to be a key account director. And he said to me, look, my job is to fulfill demand. And I looked back at him and I said, if your job was to fulfill demand, you'd be a fax machine.
Yeah, right.
Your job is to create demand. He said back to me, I never thought of it that way. It's like, yeah, I've got some coaching to do.
I mean, you could argue we're still having that same discussion, the whole like, is AI going to displace sales? And I'd say the same thing, which is, if you just want to fulfill demand, I suppose that might be okay, but you're probably going to need some humans to create demand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 30 years ago, we could have systems sharing, I don't remember what the technology is, but sharing specs back and forth. You want to buy 500 HP servers? Great. What's the spec? What's the price?
Yeah.
What can you deliver?
Yeah.
That doesn't require human intervention if it's commodity. If I'm buying my first Salesforce intelligence system, I've never bought it before. I don't know what the possibility is. I need someone that has seen the patterns that can help me reduce risk in my environment. And the close no lost is mostly, from my perspective, a risk calculation of, yeah, the current environment might suck, but we understand it. We know how to deal with it. When we show up at 8 o'clock every morning, we know what to do when the system goes haywire. If I introduce something new, that's an unknown. I'm going to stick with my current known.
Well, that's a big part of the Jolt story is, look, something is going to go wrong. And so what's going to happen when that happens? Who's going to get blamed? What's the consequence of it? That's that we call it the fear of messing up, which becomes a really big factor in the decision process. But backing up a moment, what you're pointing to there is like the differentiating factor in the decision is often the seller and the way in which you can kind of convey value and expertise and build comfort with kind of what's going to come next. That's, again, dating back to that 2007, 2008 timeframe. That was one of the big findings, is that more than half of customer loyalty was defined based on how we sell, not what we sell to them. So less and less about the products themselves or the price or what have you, but rather the degree to which we can add value through that sales experience. That I don't think has changed at all. That's a lot where the challenger came. And that's, to your point, the engagement model was then, okay, well, can we use this as a way to sort of disrupt the customer's point of view and get them to think differently and therefore give ourselves a leg up? The notion of buyers valuing insight, I mean, even you referenced our latest study, Activator Advantage, clear through line, right? That buyers continue to value insight and our ability to help them understand what comes next. The stylistic way in which we do that, I think there has been some evolution there, and you can see some of those threads in some of our latest work as well. But also the type of insight that you're sharing, I think, has changed. And, we could probably debate whether that's because the buyer continue to learn more about why they should buy. And so therefore the value is more on the what I should buy and how I should buy part of the story. I think that's probably the case. But we talk a lot when we're in training classrooms with our clients is like the more you can pull insight from your customer experience and pull it into the sales experience, the better off you're going to be.
So pulling insight from your customer experience. So be specific, Ted. Who has that insight? Is it the CSM? Who is it that has that perspective?
Yeah, well, hopefully everybody does, but that's part of the reason we say if you don't know the answer about what makes your customers happy or sad, go buy a cup of coffee with your customer success team or your account management team or whoever's job. It could be the implementation team, it could be the onboarding team. It depends on what you're selling and what that process looks like. But somebody does. Somebody at that organization has a sense for it. And the best sellers are really good about extracting that and saying, you know what, we've learned about how this all work and the lessons we've learned to minimize the degree to which there's going to be mess ups here. I need to help you understand what we do in order to get ahead of that. And it just gives this relief and comfort to the buyer.
Right. Here's the challenge, Ted. In every product company I've ever worked for, product-centric company, where there was Oracle or Google or many smaller ones, as soon as the salesperson lands the deal, they disappear. They are not incented structurally. They are not allowed to remain with that implementation, to have visibility on that implementation. Someone selling to a large account may well still have the account and focus on the account, but they are not incented to pay attention to the implementation. In professional services, and again, we're going to get to that in a little bit, in professional services, it's quite different, typically. But on the product side, we totally block the ability of the product-centric salesperson to understand what the patterns are post-sale, right? So I think it was the Gartner trough of despair, right? Salesperson celebrates, Customer realizes, oh shit, we actually have to do some work. Now they're in the trough of despair, and they run into all the things that are required to actually have a successful implementation.
So fair enough that structurally and from a job perspective, they aren't walking that walk with customers and they hand that off. I would argue, though, that doesn't stop the seller. At some point, you have to up your game. We talk to sellers about if you want your buyers to feel like fully informed buyers, you've got to act like a fully informed seller. And that means you got to do a little bit more homework. And sorry to tell you, but maybe go have some conversations with those folks. Now, better if, to your point, leadership is facilitating some of that or creating structures that allows for more of that. I don't know that that requires us to make everyone into both hunter farmers. You could still understand those dynamics, and again, we could get into the weeds as to what that manifests as in the sales process. But the point being is, if you're the seller, don't lose sight of the fact that a big part of what's in that buyer's mind is what's going to come next.
Yep. You make a great point, Ted, and we throw around the phrase coin-operated salespeople. So the B-level or C-level coin-operated salesperson closes the deal and moves on. The A-level salesperson, who is also coin-operated, will close the deal, stick with it, gather the information, leverage that information for the next deal. And their coin operation works out a whole lot better.
Yeah, but again, that could be a light touch, hey, buyers like you typically have great experiences with this, and they report back to us things like this. And I'm just sharing that as an insight into the sales experience. And because of that, I might spend a little bit more time myself doing though, but I'm going to save myself tons of time in pursuit because it's going to be far more efficient. Buyers going to feel better. They won't engage in excessive exploration. All sorts of things speed up if I just maybe slow down a little bit as that seller.
Yep. The first time I heard the phrase "help me see around corners" was during a key account planning session about 10 years ago. And the CIO said to my team, "Help me see around corners. Help me to know what I don't know that I don't know. Help me to understand what I need to be planning for in the next couple of iterations of running my business." And you touch on, if I remember correctly, you touch on that term repeatedly in the Activator Advantage.
Yeah, well, so for your audience, the Activator Advantage is a study that focuses in on professional services. So think lawyers, accountants, bankers, consultants. These are doer sellers, right? As part of their job, they have to sell, but often they prefer not to, and they'd rather just be a lawyer, a banker, accountant, consultant, and what have you. That idea of the person in professional services looking around corners, I would guess actually people in that profession would say that's gone on maybe for much longer because in many ways their product is their expertise.
That's the job of a lawyer from lawyer one was to say, let me tell you what's going to happen if you do this. Here's the risk inherent in doing that. Absolutely.
But how I package that matters. And some of the things we found in Activator indicate some evolution there, So in the past, you might have only done that for a small, close set knit of relationships and for clients, or you would have only done it when I'm engaged with that buyer, when, for example, if I've got an open case or trial or matter as a lawyer or an open audit as an accountant or an open project as a consultant, and because they're paying us, and therefore that's when I offer that insight. The winning profile in that study, the Activator, was really clever about finding ways to add insight at all points, kind of flowing it throughout their network, which of course begs the question, how do they find time for that? How do they monetize that? How do they win business there too? But the dynamics certainly have changed.
I read the Activator Advantage from the perspective of services salespeople selling high-level services that they and multi-million-dollar services that they may not personally deliver, as opposed to a doctor or lawyer or Indian chief. The individual who is the kill and eat, right? And so someone selling at Wipro or IBM Global Solutions, they have the same set of requirements about how to maintain their presence with their buying community that any activator does or any professional salesperson does. And they don't physically deliver. They do remain pretty close to the delivery side. So, and as we talked about before, I actually extend that model to portfolio sellers at a company like IBM or HPE or others, or many, many smaller companies where someone's selling a portfolio and having an overall impact on an organization. And that key account director is not selling individual products, right? They may have people under them, brand salespeople under them who do sell individual products. Their job is to look at, where am I going with this organization? Where can I help this organization go? If I'm calling on Cincinnati Children's Hospital, I want to focus on patient outcomes. And any individual product has almost nothing to do, obviously, nothing obvious to do with patient outcomes. When applied properly, it helps tremendously with patient outcomes, right? Nobody wants to get stuck in an elevator with a gurney with a patient where the elevator hasn't been serviced for 6 months, right?
Yeah.
Simple, stupid example.
Yeah, no, there are a whole bunch of parallels. I think that salespeople and senior strategic executive type individuals of all stripes that can learn, from that study. Some of the lessons from that study lend themselves to something that is a little bit more specific to a world in which you are always there is no end to the sales cycle. You are the person who's looked to execute that, and you have to balance your time because you're only a part-time seller, right? So one of the big findings for the Activator is they make this broad commitment to business development. Well, if your whole job is business development or relationship management or key account selling, maybe that's less of an issue. But how they create value, how they go about connecting across their network, how they flow value through their network, certainly I think there's definite parallels there. And partly because one of the early big findings in the Activator study was just this sense of declining loyalty from buyers over time. And I think that's true across the board, all sorts of different places. And it's, I think, rooted in this interesting place, which is that buyers have access to what feels like a dispersion of expertise across the market. So they don't no longer have to, I mean, of course, Gen AI is maybe the best example of this, where they don't have to necessarily have to go to the top brands or the top providers always and rely on that. They can go and just on a Sunday night, go and type in and kind of get that. That's one example, but many, many more boutiques, many more startups, all sorts of different places in which they can go and access that expertise. And so it should keep us all on our toes. Just because you're the big brand or the sort of major player in the market doesn't guarantee you that that buyer is not going to entertain ideas from other people.
Yeah, I ran a quick experiment a few weeks ago on ChatGPT. I asked it to outline the issues I should consider for an AI-based sales intelligence platform. And ChatGPT came back with a pretty reasonable overview. It came up with a list of 10 vendors who I should consider, and I'd heard of some of them. And to your point,
were they all real?
We'll leave that part aside. Yes, they were all real.
Okay.
I had heard of some of them, and some of them I had not heard from. And there were a couple that were clearly inappropriate for that application. And then Chad asked me, and I have a nice back and forth relationship with my implementation. It said, would you like me to write you an RFP? It's like I went from initial, latent pain to I got an RFP, on the street in about 8 minutes.
Yeah. As somebody who at other parts of my career had to help write answers to RFP questions, I just groaned because those are the absolute worst.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, the power of highly informed buyers remains, very big. And again, that's only grown over time.
So let's take it from the other perspective. What's the impact of all these AI-based information providing platforms for salespeople? Is it a good thing that I can sit down and ask, what do I need to know about XYZ company? Tell me the history of its key business challenges. Where is it focusing on? And ChatGPT can go out and find all the public information about their quarterly reports and, presentations and all that. And it can come back with a pretty good analysis. And I, as a salesperson, can read that analysis. One, have I internalized it?
Yeah.
And two, at Google, we were trained for the 30-3-30, right? If you've got 30 minutes scheduled with a senior exec, be ready for 30 seconds, right? They might say, listen, my schedule is gone. Tell me what's up. 30 seconds or 3 minutes. When you take that input from an external source and you don't internalize it as you would when you're showing creativity and finding it yourself, you press 3 on the elevator to go to see the VP of marketing and the CEO walks on and presses 14. You've got 45 seconds to pitch, to introduce yourself, to make a deposit in the relationship bank account with the CEO. You can't pull out your phone and go, what should I say to Charlie, right? You have to be ready, right?
Yep.
It's improv. As Daniel Pink says, sales and improv are the same thing.
Dan is such a good way of taking complex things and making them simple.
And I read that in his book, To Sell is Human, and I immediately joined Cape Cod Improv, and I'm having a blast.
That's
shit.
Great. That's terrific. I love that. Just as a total aside, I know some folks who you just reminded me of this. This is complete a non sequitur, but Second City in Chicago, their improv group actually does like sales training. They have I think they still do it. I'm not totally positive, but to your point, yeah, there's definitely things you can learn by thinking on your toes.
One of my corporate clients did an improv session at their last sales kickoff. You have to be present.
Yeah.
You have to listen. You have to take care of your partner. Is that not enterprise selling?
Yeah, but you know more than I would based on your training as an improv artist. But there's a framework and an approach behind it, right? You got the yes ands and I only know it. That's basically the depth of my knowledge on improv. Going back to your question, I think about because there's two sides to that AI story. There's the seller using it and the ability for them to be prepared for it, and then there's the buyer using it. And I think both of those things are important stories to understand. I think you were going with the seller side, so we can start
Yeah,
there.
that's the side that you and I focus on, right? The buyer is going to do what they're going to do. They're going to use AI to inform themselves for better or for worse. And we can't control that. We just have to be prepared for it. And we can help manage how sales organizations prepare natively and prepare for that additional information.
Yeah. Well, so we can circle back to this, but you asked that question earlier about looking around corners about professional services. That's been a long hallmark of B2B, classic B2B selling. The nature of that, though, I think has evolved a little bit in the place where the buyer is learning a lot more about why they should buy and who they should buy from on their own. And so then, therefore, what are the corners you're looking around for them? But we can get back to that in a moment because it speaks, I think, in a big way to the differentiating role the seller plays, which I think has changed. But to your question on the prep and the research that a seller can do there, look, we've known for a long time. I mean, going back to my days at CEB, 2004, 5, 6, we were doing these time productivity assessment studies. And it was very clear even then that pre-call prep was a distinguishing characteristic of a high performing seller. And so they walked in the door having a very clear sense for about what that business is, who those people are, what that kind of picture looks like. And then if they didn't have information yet, they would use those first couple interactions to learn more about the organization. Having said that, it's still, what, 20 years later, and I can tell you that every single room I walk into with a sales team, 70% of them still do not do that pre-call prep. Maybe that might be generous. It might be more like 85 or 90% still don't do that prep.
That's just
The
scary.
excuse has gone away, though, right? Like to your point, these tools are now at your fingertips,
Mm-hmm.
and the excuse has gone away. That still doesn't mean that they're doing it. But I will say, even if they are doing that type of research, I still think there are a couple of hurdles that the seller will face there. One is just the lens through which they do that research. So the altitude that they think about. Too many sellers kind of get pulled down to the user level or to the person who's on the team who's going to be driving some of that decision and aren't thinking through the C-suite business outcome lens. And so consequently, the types of things that they're just going to go and look at features and functions that person or the type of role that junior person is doing, not so much about the business, which is a shame because to your point, a lot of that is publicly available, the investor calls and what have you. But the other thing is just about the time you're investing, in it. There's too many people, and there are reasons for this, some of which you could say is about the tech stack that they're asked to use, is much more of like a spray and pray sort of approach and try to go volume and quantity as opposed to quality. And so, even the type of research they do, it's like key executives and then move on. They're not trying to get to the heart of like, what are the key business challenges this company's had? What's the arc and the story for this company? But I digress.
Yeah. I love your points of many salespeople focus on the what as opposed to the why. It's the mechanics of, oh, you need this widget? Yeah, we've got this widget. Our widget is better because it's different. I'll never forget walking into the main headquarters of Merck outside of Philadelphia and seeing a banner over the front hallway that says, if we don't act quickly, 4 million mothers will die. 10 years ago, that was an initiative that they had launched to improve healthcare, I think, in developing countries. And today, that initiative is still going on. And so when I met with my key account team at Oracle that was calling on Merck, I said, let's think about the context in which your customers go to work every day. Not the, hey, we need to be on database 11i, right? Oracle 11i. We need to solve this in the same way I was talking about patient outcomes before. And part of my goal was to create that common purpose for the team where every member of the team would come in and have that same call to action for the customer, which is a high level strategic business, OKRs or objectives conversation, as opposed to we're going to save you $8 on the upgrade, or we're going to give you this incremental capability. And that's a rallying cry. And even at an individual, if Joe was calling on Acme Manufacturing, he can have that same rallying cry. It doesn't need to come from a key account team. It can be one person selling one widget. They don't have to focus on the widget.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And you're speaking to, I think, something a little bit bigger that, in some ways it's like an obvious statement, which is that, companies and organizations are made up of people. But when we go to sell to them, we treat them like ROI calculator robots, and it's so easy to fall into that trap that people make decisions purely on the numbers and purely on a rational basis. That's been a theme in both the JOLT study and the Activator study in different ways.
Yeah. I want to highlight this because I think this is one of the key points that came out for me, that most sales organizations, Drucker said, the purpose of a company is to create a customer, right? And people think, well, to create customers, I'm going to go sell them shit, right? Nope. That's not it at all, right? So what you're hitting on is people go to work for a reason. And when they engage with a salesperson, they're not doing that ROI calculation. Ted, what is going on in their mind or in their hearts?
Well, I mean, look, to be clear, that is one factor, of course. And in some ways, it's like I think about it as like a necessary but insufficient thing to get through to the sale. But there's a lot of emotion that kind of goes into it. You were talking about the mission and values of Merck, as being one example. What gets them out of the bed in the morning? What are the things that really drive them? What are the lenses through which they therefore hire people and motivate people? And, what do they want to spend time on? The fear of failure that we sort of explored in depth around Joel, a lot, it's a human emotion.
Right. And failure leads to, if I'm a manager and I make a decision and that fails, what happens?
Well, people start pointing fingers. I lose political clout, political capital. I lose face. I look silly. People start assigning blame. People, in worst case, people get fired.
Right.
We talk about the difference between the fear of missing out, which is so much of the why should I change part of the story versus the fear of messing up. And what that tells you is that fear of messing up, that my job matters more to me than your 10% discount, to put a finer point on it, right?
Or 30%, as I've seen recently in multi-million-dollar deals. 30%?
Yeah.
No thanks. Business as usual.
Right.
Fine. It sucks.
Yeah.
And it's fine.
The best is the 10% or 20 or 30% discount that's only good for the next 5 days,
And the customer says, it's only good for these 5 days. And a year from now, I'm going to remember that and hold it against you.
Yeah, exactly. It's so transparent, but we all sort of do it because we're grasping at straws there kind of at the late stage. But yeah, like I care more about my job or how my team sees me or the political capital that I've built up over time than I do about that 10% discount. In the Activator Advantage, we talk about the personal value that you can deliver for those clients, even between engagements and what have you. And so that's like, think about the personal frustrations that your customers have about their job or their team or about their career, but there's ways that you can add value that go far beyond the product or service that you're selling.
You had a couple of different models in the JOLT effect of salespeople, more effective versus less effective salespeople. And then you put a fine point on it in the Activator Advantage. I love the CSI profile that you create, right? That profiler that you create of that highly effective salesperson. And again, you say there is no pure activator, right? If you look at attributes, people have multiple attributes. They may have strength in 1 or 2 or 3. And an additional point you make in the book is we can both hire to that model, to that profile, and we can build people towards that model. So you don't take it as a given of this person has this capability or not. We can train them to be more this way. Let's talk a little bit about the activator profile. What are the strengths of it and why is the activator so effective?
Yeah, first I should note, going back to your earlier question about me being the data nerd, I can't help but point out that it wasn't us picking these profiles. The data told us that there are these people out there. This is not our opinion, but nonetheless, it's showing up in the data. And you're making another point about this that's an important bit of context as well, which is that we don't typically study kind of personality type drivers, mostly because those things are really hard to change. And so we focus most of our research on behavioral factors, skills and behaviors that people can work towards and improve and change. And so while some of our research, like I'll speak in a moment to the activator, speaks to kind of the general way in which that person may act on a day-to-day basis, kind of their disposition, if you will, from a go-to-market perspective, we can all kind of lean harder and more often in a certain direction. And that's the way to think about kind of improvement. Like if we could act a little bit more like Lee today, I might have a chance to have a little more success, but that doesn't change necessarily who I am as a person. So the Activator study was a survey-based approach where we surveyed, I think now we've surveyed almost 3,000 partners inside of professional services organizations, asked them to take a pretty in-depth survey, 45-minute behavioral survey where we asked them all sorts of questions about how you go to market, how you pitch business, how you cultivate relationships, how you network, how you name it, we sort of asked it. And then we got performance data from the participating firms in the study, which allowed us to understand sort of what are the best performers and what distinguishes them from others. So as part of the analysis, we ran what's called a conjoint analysis, which essentially, if you think about throwing all the data points up into the air and seeing how they kind of naturally cluster when they fall, that's kind of what we're doing there. And as it turns out, there are 5 different ways that professional services partners kind of go to market. It's kind of, again, the disposition they bring when they decide, this is how I'm going to go to market. Some of that might be based off of how I've been mentored, how I've been incentivized, how I've just observed, what people do. But nonetheless, turns out there are 5 different approaches. The activator is one of those 5 profiles, and it turns out to be the winning profile when you look at the predictive analysis that tells us when you run the predictive model against outcomes like the person who closes the most business, who upsells the most, cross sells the most, and whatnot, across the board, this person wins by far. The activator is distinguished across these 5 profiles. I'll take you kind of across the 5 and then understand a little bit more about the activator. So the first profile we found in that study was called the expert, or we called it the expert. That is something we did choose. We did choose the name, the data points just to kind of pointed us there. So think about the expert as kind of the reluctant business developer. They're the person who feels like, I didn't go to business school or law school to become a seller. I'd rather focus all of my time on being that consultant or being that lawyer. And so when they go to sell, they typically keep that hat on as that expert, right? They're trying to attract people to their expertise. And therefore, they sort of knock on my door when they have a need. And so they speak on stages or they try to put their name on thought leadership because, though, they sort of take that approach. Often by the time they hear from these clients, they're also talking to a few other people. So they find themselves in very competitive pursuits and try to wow them with their expertise. That's kind of the expert. Next one over is confidant. So the confidant think about the confidant as kind of the old school classic trusted advisor.
Mm-hmm.
The person who's got this kind of tight-knit network of people they've probably known going back to law school or business school, and they've cultivated over time. In fact, one of the best quotes from that study was from a dyed-in-the-wool confidant who said, my approach to go to market is I stayed close to my friends and then I turned 40. It's kind of my approach.
I go to the country club with lots of cards.
There's that, right? But these people, of course, are true experts. It's just their approach is I'm going to create this like moat around this small group of people, and then I'm going to try to win business by white glove service over time and just try to sell them more and more stuff over time. And then you've got the activator. So the activator, think about them as sort of a super connector, who's trying to build a very robust and diverse network inside their own firm, inside the client organization, even third-party individuals across their network who could be useful. The lawyer who can recommend the accountant, the banker who can recommend the consultant, and what have you, making introductions. And
the difference between the confidant and the super connector from a Malcolm Gladwell perspective is the confidant goes deep. The super connector goes broad.
In terms of their network, that's probably true, right? I wouldn't necessarily say that's true in terms of the expertise that they convey or the type of work that they might do.
Agreed.
But yes, in terms of the focus of their network, right, is the confidence kind of, I'm going deep and then I've got sharp elbows if anyone tries to get in, right? Because that is their sort of bread and butter, right? That's how they're going to win business. Short story, by the way, on confidence is that in a world where declining loyalty is happening, it's less and less true that the thing that's going to predict the next piece of business is that I did great work on the last piece of business. And so if you're pinning all your hopes there, you're going to have a shrinking book of business over time. I'll share more on the activator here in a moment. The 4th and 5th profile is the debater. For those of you that are familiar with the challenger sale, the debater profile will look pretty similar or feel pretty familiar because this is somebody who is kind of that contrarian. They kind of feel like they have a different perspective of the world. They're not afraid. In fact, they're quite eager to share what that perspective is. And so they're looking for the client to kind of follow their lead in that vein. Turns out, by the way, in professional services, the debater finished last.
Yeah.
Whereas, 10, 15 years ago, when we studied this in B2B sales, they finished first, that type of profile. Now, that's not a perfect one-to-one comparison because the activator is doing a lot of insight-led type things and flowing value. And think about the debater as like spiking hard in that sort of contrarian stylistic approach, but interesting nonetheless.
So back originally when we talked about selling with a point of view, it was having a very strong point of view And debate wasn't necessarily a significant component of that. In the Activator Advantage, debate seems to be the key, with the point of view being less important. Am I characterizing it correctly?
It's more, I think, look, when you are the product, when your brain is the product and you're showing up every time trying to show the buyer why they're wrong, it just gets tiresome
Yep.
over time,
Yep.
right? And so that's part of it. I think even in Jolt, you could see some elements of, look, I still value insight. I still value your ability to teach me new things. But, in a world where I fear as much failure as anything else, and I feel, kind of out there exposed on a ledge, on my own, maybe don't shove me off, the ledge, is perhaps part of it. But I digress there. The last profile is the realist. So the realist is, you could look at some of the things the realist is doing, honestly, and some of the jolters do some of these things. The realist feels like, I look at this world of other people who are overpromising and saying yes to everything, and I say, I'm going to distinguish myself by being very clear and transparent, overly transparent with my clients about what we can and can't do, what's a no-win proposition and what's something that's worthwhile doing. They're very protective of their team's time. And so they're comfortable telling the client no in certain situations. There are some markets where the realist does okay, but nonetheless, it's, again, the activator is the profile that really stands out amongst the the five profiles, I should say. And so they're making a strong commitment to business development on a regular basis. They're consistent rather than sporadic in that business development. They're connecting in a wide and deep manner, to your point. They talk about like zipper relationships inside their client organizations, going up and down, junior all the way up to the most senior as possible, trying to create that sort of synthesis across the two organizations. And then they also create a lot of value, flow of value across their network. So they're very mindful about how they do that, the forums through which they do that, and what have you.
I want to dig down on that a little bit. When you say add value, what you're talking about is a lot of informal value delivered many different ways of, hey, saw this article, thinking of you, you might find it interesting, right? Just simply forwarding a link, that's adding value, right? That's making a deposit in the relationship bank account. They don't get paid for most of that. You highlight that point in the Activator Advantage of much of the value they bring is unpaid. It's planting seeds. It's just building relationships, whether there's a transaction or even a late need on the horizon at all.
With the caveat, of course, that the activators win the most business too, right? So eventually they do get paid, right?
Yes, and they win the most business.
Exactly. Right. Yes. So it's a down payment in many respects, and they don't put a paywall up before they start kind of going there. They do believe, yeah, if I pay it forward in that respect, good things will flow from there. And there are some elements there that I think maybe are more specific to the professional services arena because, of course, they win a lot of business through referrals and what have you. And so that does happen. But yeah, a lot of people put that paywall up before they're willing to have that conversation. I will say there's another thing I think that is worthwhile for your B2B audience to contemplate, which is, you could argue even some of the work we did on Challenger contributed to this perception, which is that insight has to be a perfect, fully baked idea before I share it, and it has to be contained in this pitch deck that's been developed by marketing and blessed by marketing and trained everyone. And until that happens, be careful, don't share them. And that's not the way activators act at all.
Yeah, perfection is the enemy of good, huh?
Exactly. But it's also like, yeah, I'm going to flow ideas, good ideas, by the way, and I'm thoughtful about how I do that. But there was maybe just to put a specific point on this, there was an interview that we did at one point with the chief growth officer where he said, my activators, they like to use their mouse more than their keyboard, which I thought was an interesting way to think about, right? So it's not so much about feeling the need to be the author of all of this insight and to be the only person who's conveying this, but if I'm distributing it out and then being thoughtful about the point I make, right? You said it perfectly. I thought of you for this because, right? And how much value that gives that person and how much value it is to be in that person's orbit and in that person's network and the information you have access to and the people you have access to. That's a different form of expertise that activators are really good about harnessing.
Yeah, it's amazing. So the activator in some ways is a synthesizer of information and then a sharer, right? They pull it together and then they send out a curated point of view.
Yeah, we like to say that they consider themselves like general contractors for expertise. And by the way, they're experts in their own right, but that's also a different form of expertise. And you can imagine for the buyer how valuable that is, that you can harness that type of expertise, convey it, make introductions and what have you. That same thing, by the way, holds true in B2B sales. In the Jolt, we talk about limiting the expiration. Specifically, there's a skill we call owning the flow of information, which is very much about harnessing the collective expertise of the organization. You talk about tech sales. it's very common for me to have an army of people come in and help to convey expertise and value. Your technical sales team, you've got post-sale implementation teams. The best sellers are able to harness that and convey it in the sales experience in a way that feels very guided in nature, whereas trying to abdicate responsibility and just have the other people do it feels disjointed for the buyer. So there's another example of a parallel across the two studies.
Ted, I have to give a shout out to one of my clients who read that part of the JOLT effect. And she said to me, "Oh my God, I've been letting my SEs run rampant. And after reading that section, I now know I have to control them, that I'm going to tell them when to talk and when to shut up." And she was nicer about it. But she called that out in a coaching conversation, that she specifically found that in that section of your book. And it's changed her approach to managing her technical resources. And she's a key account director on 2 accounts, both multi-billion-dollar organizations.
No, I'm glad to hear that. I have to say, it just so happens that just yesterday I had a conversation with a head of pre-sales at a sizable software organization that your audience would know. And it's interesting. It's the first time that Joel came out almost 3 years ago. It's the first time I've ever heard somebody have this interpretation, which is almost the exact opposite of what we intended, which is that owning the flow of information means that you have to go it alone and that you sort of block other people out. It's the opposite, which is that, of course, you have to be able to harness those people. It's natural and expected that you're going to bring those people in. We do talk about, look, try to run as many demos yourself as you can, because you'd rather err on that side of, hey, I'm the person who can be the trusted expert for you, Mr. and Mrs. Customer. But it's expected and necessary to bring in those people. And so, but the role you play there as a seller is, to quarterback and orchestrate the experience, to bring them in and on that conversation. It's a really, really important skill.
This particular coaching client, and I won't mention the company name, it's got 3 letters, but 315,000 people are at her disposal. And it's up to her to curate who goes and prep them ahead of time and make sure that they don't go down a technical rat hole that will distract from the strategic conversations, the OKRs or strategic objectives. And I think I've only been in tech sales for all my life, and I've been a sales engineer. Let me show my expertise. The more I talk, the better. It's like, nope, not true. Then the rep as orchestrator of, here's what I want you to cover, here's when I want you to be done, is really important.
I've been that product expert too, not actually, I guess, in a technical and non-technical part. And I think, yes, it's true in terms of the mindset of both that technical solutions person and the seller, because of course, what I've also experienced, I'm sure you have too, is the seller who opens up the call and says, "Lee, I'm so glad you got a chance to meet the customer. Lee, take it away." And they recede into the background for the next 58 minutes. Like, that also isn't good either, right? The buyer's sitting there thinking, why is this person even here? They just set up the conversation. I guess the next time I have a question, I'll just figure it out myself.
And so, to put a fine point on it, what she said was, I have to be the expert. I have to continue to position myself as the expert. And my brand specialist, my sales engineer, they are people that support me in that function. And we're a team, and I'm the lead.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of sellers out there that probably just cringe when you said that, because, like, it's true. We talk about striving for expertise. That verb there is important. Yeah, you're trying to convey to the buyer that you are the trusted expert along the way. That requires you to both earn that trust and also convey that expertise. That doesn't mean you're doing it on your own all of the time. But to the point we were making a moment ago, your ability to harness that expertise is a form of expertise on its own. It will feel like a source of authority for your buyer, right? I know where these things are going. I've been down this road before. I drive this train on your behalf.
I love this conversation. And in the interest of time, I want to bridge over to one last topic. And that's something you touch on in the latter chapters of the Activator Advantage. And that's authenticity. It's the salesperson that actually really wants to improve patient outcomes, right? Not just because they're going to sell some shit, but they actually are aligned. I had a salesperson at Google who he called on Beyond Meat, and he would send his customers pictures of him and his family at the beach, in Southern California, eating their burgers, right? He was all in. And so that's alignment. But it goes beyond that. It's not, okay, I'm going to show that I'm aligned, right? No, it's being authentic. It's actually, because people can tell, right? Your context is written on your forehead. If you show up saying, you're my source of groceries, right? They see that. If your context really is, I'm here to help your organization succeed, I'm here to help you individually succeed, you can't fake that, right? Your words show it, your actions show it, your behavior shows it. Talk to me about that.
Going way back to, one of the reasons I wanted to be in the sales practice at CEB, and you could see it throughout our studies. Matt's talked about it, Brent's talked about it. We talk about we really do believe in trying to shine a light on the sort of altruistic side of sales. And there's so much out there, about the salespeople you want to avoid or the salespeople you don't want to talk to, or, in professional services, you hear maybe not firm leaders, but nonetheless, in off the record conversations, they'll say sales is the 4-letter word. They don't want to be seen as salespeople. The reason we feel so strongly about this is because when you spend time with, especially certain types of high performing sellers, they very much have the best interest in mind, not just of that company, but of the people that they work with. And you're right, it comes through in a very authentic way. Just to give, a couple of small examples, and it speaks a little bit to that personal side of the value equation, which is like, who is this person? What do they care about in their job? What are the frustrations that they have? Have they been promoted or have they not been promoted? What is their mission and values? I remember an activator that I interviewed as part of the study, he would just, you can imagine he does this type of thing all the time, but it was a Saturday afternoon. He saw a billboard for a customer of his and he was super excited. He took a quick pic, sent it on. He's not trying to ask for anything. He's just saying, like, I was excited about this. And he truly was excited about like this new campaign that they're running, or the fact that he's with his kids and he sees that, and that, I think, authenticity is really important. The barometer, by the way, that an activator will use often to know, have they kind of crossed that threshold with a buyer? And there are implications to this in terms of time spent as well. But if you can text this person and they text you right back, you know that you are sort of have a good relationship with them. Now, you can't do that with a million customers, right? So that means you got to prioritize and you got to think about, what's the tiering I'm going to use. But it's an interesting way to think about, how can I think about this person acting like a peer of mine, even I don't know, it doesn't have to be a friend necessarily, but you're acting, again, sort of in a very authentic way about caring about their outcomes.
We've touched a lot on authenticity in prior episodes, and I love the fact that it's a fundamental part of your research and your writings as well, because I think in this fast-paced technical sales world, so much of what salespeople are enabled with is the facts and features as opposed to the how and why, right? How much deliberate practice do we do in sales organizations? Yeah. Almost none, right? People hate to role play. Most salespeople hate to role play. They feel uncomfortable. And a few people love to role play because they are building muscle memory.
Yeah.
And they are consciously focusing on their skill sets and their ability to pivot when necessary or to be in the moment so that they don't have to be thinking, what should I say next? Instead, they know what to say next. They're listening, they're attentive, they're in the moment.
Having safe places to practice, I think, has always been sort of a hallmark, or finding them, I guess, and using those forms is kind of a hallmark of high performance. I think, for what it's worth, the story's still playing out here, but there seems like there's some promise in AI tooling actually that can help with some of the role plays. We'll see where that goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Ted, this has been a fabulous conversation. A couple of recent books that we'll point to, and I'll put links. One is The JOLT Effect. People know that book well, hopefully, by now. It's been out since 2022.
Late 2022,
Yep. The Activator Advantage came out in May of this year, May 2025. I'll put links for both into the show notes. Any final comments or takeaways that you'd like to share with the audience, Ted?
Just, I would love to, anyone who's interested, would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. So look me up. We've got a couple of businesses that help organizations with this type of stuff. So our B2B training and advisory business is called Selling Innovations. You can find us at sellinginnovations.com. And then our professional services business that caters for heads of business development and managing partners in professional services, that firm is called DCM Insights.
DCM, D as in Delta.
Dixon, Channer, McKenna.
There you go.
DCM Insights. Yeah, so DCM Insights. That's right.
Fabulous conversation, Ted. Thank you for the time.
Of course, happy to be here. Really enjoyed it.
Another deep dive into the topic of sales excellence and the performance mindset. If you found this conversation interesting, I would appreciate it if you would share the podcast with a coworker or two. And to explore this topic in more depth, send me a note via the contact form on podcast.thoughtsonselling.com or find some time for us to talk at meet.acellergroup.com. Thanks.